Good morning, everybody. This is Mr. Jordan. Today we're going to move at our typical May breakneck pace and go over U.S. foreign policy and national security issues in about a day. I'm out today with a medical issue. What you can do is you can email me questions that you have regarding foreign policy, regarding the reading you did last night in Wilson, and I'd be happy to field those questions. Tomorrow I'm also out because of a Model UN trip to Fitchburg State U, and the test will be tomorrow on foreign policy. You can see that you have a handout here that kind of walks you through it, so that way we can move through this PowerPoint pretty quickly. Okay, so American foreign policy instruments. What I mean by instruments is how is foreign policy actually pursued or used? How can the U.S. get what it wants out of its relationships with other countries? And that's really what foreign policy is all about. Coming up with formalized policy decisions that regulate our relationship with other countries. Given our system of politics, we have shifts in our foreign policy, usually related to changes in presidential administrations. We have three tools for foreign policy. The first is the military. You saw in Why We Fight how often the military is used by the United States, and the next slide will show you how that is used extensively. The military is using military force to force or compel countries to do what you want them to do. The next is economic sanctions. Usually this could mean a trade repercussion, like an increase of taxes on a given country's goods being imported into the United States. It could also mean a cut of U.S. foreign aid. This would be sort of going along with, you might remember from U.S. History 2 or AP U.S., the idea of dollar diplomacy. That was William Howard Taft's idea of giving money to countries in Latin America to compel them to do what we wanted them to do. It also can be used to prop up regimes that are not really loved by their own people, but loved by the United States. The U.S. has a history of propping up unpopular governments abroad because those governments support U.S. foreign policy objectives. And the next is diplomatic, trying to resolve conflicts through dialogue and a discussion. This is often the most time-consuming and, in many respects, the most difficult to achieve. So the military is the oldest and still the one that would be the go-to default. As you can see with North Korea, we're not doing a great job, nor are they doing a great job, trying to resolve these tensions along the border of the 38th parallel in a negotiated manner. Economic policy, that is becoming more and more powerful. So if a country is out of line, we could do something such as freeze assets in our very large banks, which would mean that they can't move their money out of our bank. And diplomatic, as we mentioned before, is the quietest, but in some respects the best when it works out. So you see here on this slide how many times the United States has intervened in the Caribbean and in Central America since 1900. The period of Teddy Roosevelt and big stick diplomacy. One of the questions I was left with at 9/11 was, why do they hate us? And they being people outside of the United States. I remember my first time going to a U.S. soccer match, and it was in the early 90s, and it was against Honduras. And Honduran immigrants who had gathered in the stadium booed the U.S. national anthem. That's because I had no real idea that the United States had intervened in Honduras and had promoted and supported a right-wing government there. So, who carries out U.S. foreign policy? Well, we have different people that we have to work with in order to carry out this foreign policy. The first is the UN, the United Nations. The United Nations is a majority of the UN, I believe something like 70% of the United Nations, is funded by the U.S. government. Surprisingly, though, the UN faces a lot of scrutiny in the U.S. because some people believe that, especially on the right, that the UN constitutes a sort of quasi-world government. This is not actually true. The UN lacks a lot of enforcement powers in order to carry out its visions of collective security, of ending hunger, of respecting human rights on the world stage. And the only actual actor within the United Nations that can use military force to compel anyone to doing anything is the UN Security Council. And the UN Security Council requires 5 votes, what we call 5 permanent members, P5 members, to act in total unanimous concert. Obviously, the United States is one of those 5 permanent members, so fears of a UN takeover of the U.S. are unfounded. Next, regional organizations. NATO, that stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is our primary military alliance that was set up after World War II to protect against a possible Soviet invasion of Western Europe. It has since expanded into Eastern Europe, which has irritated the Russians to some degree. NATO is responsible for the military operation in Afghanistan. The EU, which was set up with the encouragement of the United States under the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, was designed to, at first, be an easy way for the U.S. to trade with our European partners, but now has kind of moved into the long-term vision is to create a sort of United States of Europe, and the EU is in trouble due to currency problems that it's having in a lot of the southern countries in the European Union. The next, multinational corporations. This is the fastest growing and most powerful element of actors on the world stage. Multinational corporations are corporations that don't really have a national identity behind them. They have the goal, of course, of making money, and they also have the financial resources to influence governmental policy, not only here in the United States, but in other countries around the world. Non-governmental organizations, what is commonly called NGOs. NGOs are often charitable organizations that seek to improve some aspect of life around the world. A good example of this would be the British-based organization Oxfam, which tries to end hunger and poverty around the world. Another good example would be an organization called Amnesty International. Amnesty International is an organization, also based out of Britain, which tries to end the persecution of what they call political prisoners or prisoners of conscience. These are people who, because of what they believe, are in jail. People like the Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi. Policymakers. These are, of course, elected officials around the world, people like the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the President of the United States. And individuals. Sometimes individuals can be part of the foreign policy conversation. You might have heard of a man named Julian Assange, who is the founder of an organization called WikiLeaks, which leaked a bunch of very sensitive U.S. Cables or diplomatic conversations. American foreign policy makers, we've got obviously the president, the diplomats. Diplomats are led by the U.S. Secretary of State, and the national security establishment, which is the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are the heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. And then there's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These people give the president information on security issues from a military standpoint. We also have the NSC, which is part of the executive branch and the executive office of the president. That stands for the National Security Council. And part of the NSC is the NSA, the National Security Agency. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. One of the aspects of the NSC and the CIA is they operate using something called a black budget. We've talked about black budgets before. They're budgets in which members of Congress don't know the line items that they're appropriating for, which is supposed to shield the activities of these organizations. Their critics would say it allows them to behave in a completely unregulated way without any oversight at all from the legislative branch. Obviously, the Congress, the Senate has to approve all appointments to the diplomats. The president, though, has control over who makes up the Joint Chiefs of Staff and who makes up the NSC. The Senate, though, has to confirm a CIA head as well. So, looking at American foreign policy in a broad sense is the idea of isolationism. For most of America's history, from George Washington's warning in his farewell address to the beginning of World War I, the United States has pursued a policy, well, I should take that back actually. From Washington's farewell address to the growth of the imperialist movement in the late 1800s, the United States was isolationist, at least in Europe. The U.S. has not hesitated, though, to get involved in things in our own hemisphere. That was largely the result of the Monroe Doctrine, the foreign policy statement of President James Monroe, in which he said that the U.S. was going to be the primary influence and actor in the Western Hemisphere. And that's the Monroe Doctrine, okay? It was the official statement of U.S. isolationism. It was meant to scare Europe, okay? But at the time of its issuance, just after the War of 1812, we really had no way of enforcing it. In World War I, the U.S. ends its policy of isolationism. Just to go back, then Woodrow Wilson, as you know, famously tried to create an organization called the League of Nations. The League of Nations ends up being created, but the U.S. does not actually join the League of Nations. Republicans in the U.S. Senate voted the treaty down, which returned the U.S. back to a period of isolationism until World War II. Then, after World War II, we pursue a policy of containment. Containment is the idea that the U.S. Did not want to see communism spread, and we pursue an anti-communist agenda at home with organizations such as HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. During the Cold War, we saw a huge growth in the Pentagon and the spending on military weapons. Then we go through the tragedy of Vietnam, which makes many Americans question the use of military force as a means of attaining foreign policy objectives. In the 1970s, during the era of Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, the U.S. pursues a policy of détente. Détente is a transformation from conflict to cooperation with the Soviet Union. This begins with the famous ping-pong exchange between the U.S. and China. Richard Nixon goes to China. He recognizes the People's Republic of China diplomatically, and This scares the Soviet Union, and they seek to have a more peaceful coexistence with the U.S. It ends with the SALT talks, which was the first time that the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to mutually reduce their nuclear weapons. Okay? Since in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the U.S. has negotiated with China a status called Most Favored Nation trading status, which has really greatly changed the world dynamic because it allowed China to rise. During détente, there were some critics who thought that the ultimate objective should be to punish the Soviet Union and go after them. One of those critics would be Ronald Reagan, who, when he takes office in 1981, begins a renewal of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan noticed a defense budget that had been declining since the 1950s as an overall share of the slice. This actually corresponds with something you already know about, which is Dwight Eisenhower and his warning on the military-industrial complex in his farewell address. Reagan adds some $32 billion to the defense budget, and it scares the Soviet Union, primarily through the force or the use of something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. Star Wars was this idea that the United States could utilize satellite technology to shoot down Soviet missiles from space. Technologically, in the 1980s, the U.S. had no way of actually making this happen, although we spent a ton of money on it. But the Soviet Union, more importantly, thought that we could, and it put the Soviet Union on edge. They began to spend money that they didn't have, which ultimately leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union. George W. Bush is president during the fall of the Berlin Wall. He tries to bring in the Soviet Union into, as it collapses and becomes the Russian Federation, into the larger community of nations. And probably the greatest success of the end of the Cold War was that it didn't end with a bang, but with a whimper. And that bang, of course, could have meant the end of civilization on Earth. And the Soviet Union didn't intervene when the U.S. sought to unify East and West Germany. Since that unification in the early 1990s, we've seen Germany become the most powerful nation in Europe economically, not militarily, because of their work in NATO and their constraint within NATO. 2001 brings on the war on terror. It becomes the highest policy and priority of George W. Bush, and we spend almost 7 years of the Bush administration focused on the idea of terror. During that time, Bush pursues what he calls the Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine is just another way of saying preemptive strikes. The Bush Doctrine states that the U.S., if it believes that terrorists are at work in any nation and given sanctuary by any nation, the Bush Doctrine allows the U.S. or justifies the U.S. acting after that state and attacking that state before it can attack us. Now, after sort of the war on terror has cooled, we faced an economic meltdown in 2008. We're sort of in flux where Europe is dealing with a large financial crisis. Most recently, we're dealing with a slowdown in the Chinese economy. We're also dealing with an emergence of Brazil as one of the major players in foreign policy, which most people welcome because it could give a more robust representation of South America in the international scene. So rethinking American power, unilateralism is one concept. Unilateralism is the idea of the United States acting as an individual player in world policy. So essentially, the U.S. telling one other power what it's going to do and then acting upon it without consulting any of our allies. Now, the U.S. Did not act unilaterally in the war in Iraq, although we did put a lot of pressure on our allies abroad to support our efforts in Iraq. I think a better example of unilateralism is the 1983 invasion of Grenada. In 1983, the United States saw what it believed was an expansive Soviet presence and Cuban presence on the island nation of Grenada, and unilaterally, without consulting anyone, the United States invades Grenada. Okay. Now, what's ended up happening with Iraq and Afghanistan is that all of these powers that we consulted with, primarily the British, have lessened their obligation and their commitment to Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've sort of been left holding the bag. Multilateralism. Multilateralism is when you work with partners, okay? And it's trying to achieve foreign policy objectives with other countries. Traditionally, the United Kingdom has been our strongest ally and partner, really, since the First World War. Other countries, we've had a more difficult relationship with. A good example of that would be France, who under Charles de Gaulle had an icy relationship with the U.S. China presents for us a real opportunity and a real challenge. China is primarily concerned with restoring what it believes all of China under its auspices. Most notably, the U.S. disagrees with China trying to unify two parts of it. The first is Taiwan, which has been separate from the People's Republic of China. It's still known as the Republic of China, and it considers itself an independent sovereign country. The other is Tibet, whom many people, particularly on the American left, would like to see China leave. League of Democracies, we tend to work with countries that have the same philosophical point of view as the United States, and these tend to be our traditional allies, the British, the French, the Germans, the Canadians, the Australians, the Japanese. The politics of defense is really one about spending. We spend about 20% of the federal budget on defense, and currently in our own budget conversation, people on the right want to slash social spending but maintain high defense spending. We spend much more than anyone else on defense around the world, including probably our chief military rival, the Chinese. People on the left, however, want to cut that to preserve social programs. Now, the difficulty, though, in cutting defense spending is how defense products and defense things are made. Most defense items are made in many different Senate and congressional districts, and because of that, and because of log rolling, it's very difficult to cut the military budget. It's considered essentially a very, very expensive jobs creation program in the United States. Many people on the left believe that that might not be the best and most effective Keynesian jobs stimulus package we could come up with. If we look at the trend in defense spending, you can see that it has gone way down since the Cold War highs of the Kennedy administration. It saw a dramatic uptick during Ronald Reagan. Down here, let's see, yep, okay, down here we can see this thing called the peace dividend after the fall of the Soviet Union. Then we can see that it goes back on the upswing during the presidency of Bill Clinton, goes down again, and then George W. Bush, and then it sort of trails off as a steady part of the budget. Here's another way of looking at it. We can see the peaks and the valleys. This is defense events, and you can see that since 9/11, spending in constant dollars, not as a percentage of the budget, meaning that how much money we spend, not as a percentage of the budget, because if we go back here, this is as a percentage. Now what this shows is although defense spending is up in total dollars, it's remained flatline as a percentage of the budget. That just simply shows that the U.S. is spending more money on other things as well. We have the political matter of the fact that 1.4 million Americans either serve in the active or the reserve component of our military. These people, of course, vote, and they seek to have a very robust defense budget. We've since cut the number of active people in the National Guard, in the active component, and been more reliant on the National Guard and the Army Reserve. This is, of course, cheaper, but of course activating National Guardsmen and reservists create a lot of disruption in the personal lives of those folks who are pulled from jobs or from school. Weapons. We have a lot of nuclear weapons. We are the world's preeminent nuclear power. We have ICBMs, which stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. Then we have short-range ballistic missiles and, of course, the B-2 bombers. These are, of course, very expensive to maintain. We've agreed since the fall of the Soviet Union to a treaty called the START Treaty, which would cut the number of missiles that we have pointed at the Russians. We are now relying on non-nuclear conventional weapons, but high-tech weapons like drone aircraft, which has, of course, played a bigger role in American foreign policy and American military policy over the past couple of years. So if we look at the number of of soldiers, we can see that the U.S. is ranked second in terms of total number of military personnel. We are behind only China, who has 2.5 million active Army personnel. One of the things about that that's kind of deceptive is that in China, their military also serves as sort of a police force. So that figure is a little bit skewed. And you can see that that the U.S. Army is the largest aspect of the American military capacity. All right. Currently, there's a decreasing role of military power, and military power is losing much of its ability to shape foreign policy. That's primarily the reason is that it is so disruptive for economic purposes. America, in our policy formulation, we have corporations who play a very large role in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Military conflict is very bad for economics. We have now gone to economic sanctions as one of the primary tools of foreign policies. So we see it as one way of trying to get people to do what we want. So our current tensions with North Korea, the U.S. has imposed sanctions on North Korea for such things as that we won't sell them computer parts or electronics, and nor, of course, will any of our partners, the Japanese and the Germans. China, in a notable change, has also agreed to impose very mild sanctions on North Korea for the first time to prevent them from becoming a nuclear power. Now, sometimes these policies annoy American business. A good example of that would be sanctions against Cuba. So Coca-Cola isn't in favor of sanctions against Cuba because they used Cuban sugar to make their product for a long time. Now, of course, they use corn syrup. Iran and their petroleum, that's a great asset. We don't currently trade with Iran, and that has an economic consequence as well. Our challenges going forward are nuclear weapons, trade, immigration and border security, terrorism. We're going to develop each of these four topics separately. So you can see countries with nuclear capacity. The countries in purple are countries that are known nuclear powers, and the countries in blue have ended their nuclear weapons programs. The countries in orange have given up owning nuclear weapons and have totally disarmed themselves. We have two countries, though, that haven't announced as being nuclear powers, but it's widely thought that they have nuclear weapons, and those countries are Israel and North Korea. So the biggest issue is nuclear proliferation. That is the spread of nuclear weapons. And most countries on Earth don't have nuclear weapons. Of course, the biggest problem that nuclear weapons face isn't from major nations like China or the United States or Russia using nuclear weapons. The major fear is that what I use the term rogue, but countries that are unstable, such as Pakistan. Pakistan is fighting an insurgency from the Taliban and Muslim extremists who are going to possibly take control over the country, and that could lead to a nuclear issue between them and their neighbor to the south, India, who's also a nuclear power. So the U.S. is trying to discourage the deployment of nuclear weapons around the world. We give economic incentives to countries that say that they are going to end their nuclear weapons programs. A good example of this is North Korea. In the 1990s, North Korea announced it was pursuing a nuclear weapons program. The United States then gave them financial incentives to stop developing nuclear weapons, and as a result, for a while at least, it stopped the nuclear weapons program of North Korea. Okay. We've also created curbs on the export and import of uranium and plutonium around the world, especially our own resources. Immigration policy, of course, is a huge issue today. Currently, the Congress is considering that. In the past, we've had an open-door immigration policy. After the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, the number of immigrants to the United States from Latin America and Asia ballooned. That ended the policy of restrictive quotas, which was primarily based on race. We also set up firm border blockades against immigration trafficking in the U.S. Immigration sets up a very big domestic political issue as well as a foreign policy political issue. In the United States, labor unions are in favor of usually restrictive immigration policies, which they see cuts wages for workers in their unions, especially unskilled workers. American business would like to see less restrictive immigration policy so that those businesses can have access to cheap labor. Terrorism. We've tried to do a number of things to get other countries on board with our anti-terrorism policy. This was in a kind of low point. just after 9/11 when President Bush told the world that you were either with us or against us. Other countries all around the world, of course, deal with terrorism, and we find many willing negotiators. We've also used military power, famously in our invasions of Afghanistan and in Iraq, and also, though, and to a smaller extent, in Yemen and other unstable governments around the world. We've also used the economic policies of electronic banking, the monitoring of accounts, and better oversight of banking records by our trading partners as well. And of course, covert military operations, SEAL Team 6, the use of drone aircraft has allowed the U.S. To act without a full-scale invasion as well. In the case of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, trade in the economy, the international economy, we are in a period of interdependency, meaning that the United States is mutually dependent, and what happens in one place has a ripple effect around the world. In the case of the European Union, their currency is going through some growing pains. Many of its members are running huge budget deficits. They are unable to pay back loans, primarily to German banks. This is a problem because, unlike the United States, which can control the value of its own currency, Greece cannot devalue its currency in an effort to make those debts cheaper. And so what ends up happening around the world is austerity measures. Austerity measures are when countries cut spending and increase taxes. This, of course, places burdens on the consumers, the individuals in those countries, and what it means is that it's more difficult for those countries to buy products that we make as well. International trade, tariffs is one of the primary ways that we control the import of products from around the world. We've talked about GATT and NAFTA already, so we're going to move beyond that. Right now, the balance of trade between the United States and its trading partners is not very good. And we can see that here is who we export products to. Our number one export partner is Canada, followed by China, then Mexico. But if we were to look here, we can see that the sort of the delta, the gap, is that we are importing a larger value of our products than we are exporting. This, of course, strips resources from the country in the long term. Also, we have a dependency on foreign oil. Recently, this has improved, primarily due to hydraulic fracking and the energy that we can obtain from it in natural gas. Now the United States is actually exporting energy in the form of natural gas. Obviously, the Middle East is important for the export of oil, and given the instability in the Middle East, traditionally the U.S. has supported oppressive regimes in the Middle East, which make sure that the oil continues to come. This creates hostility with their own people who are not allowed a seat at the table and do not enjoy a share of the benefits of those oil revenues. Now we've had the Arab Spring, and much of this region remains in flux. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It cuts the price. It controls how much oil is exported, and then the price. This has been a powerful cartel. Most importantly, in the 1970s, during the energy crisis, when, in retaliation for our support to the State of Israel, OPEC slashed oil exports to the U.S., and it helped cripple our economy. Foreign aid, we give aid to our friends. Most people assume that this is a much larger percentage of the budget than it actually is. For our number one beneficiary of foreign aid is the state of Israel, which receives about $30 billion a year. However, most of this aid comes in the form of military assistance equipment that we give those countries, which of course is good for America's economy because these weapons are made here in the United States. Most Americans, though, when you ask them what you would cut, foreign aid is one of the first things that they would cut. Unfortunately, for the budget deficit, it's not really a very important slice of the budget deficit. All right. So the one thing to take away from foreign policy is that on the list of agenda items for the U.S., for the most part, foreign policy is not very important. Most Americans are interested in issues going on back here in the United States. It only becomes an issue when it enters a point of crisis. And foreign policy rarely earns politicians electoral credit. However, a mishandled foreign policy issue can cost the U.S. Politicians politically and in its overall approval rating. Most people have obviously no engagement in foreign policy at all, but those Americans who do, of course, protest. Jim McGovern, for instance, was arrested in front of the Sudanese embassy, but of course, this doesn't really change the actions of the U.S. government. We have in our foreign policy pluralism. That's because the U.S. is so diverse. We have many competing interests. So we have Muslim Americans who would like to see our policy with Israel go in a different direction. And of course, we have American Jews who would like to keep it the same. Foreign policy, well, I guess that's the end of that. Once again, if you have any questions, send me an email. Thanks. Bye.